Our topic this evening begins with us accepting without a doubt that there were enslaved Africans and their descendants in colonial New York, that they were here for over 200 years, that their presence and their work helped to create the images and lifestyles that we associate with the colonial New York, from the period of New Netherland to that of the new state. It requires us to understand that their labor was not based just in agriculture, but their work, their skills, knowledge, ingenuity, curiosity, imagination, and force of will existed through every level of society. From the Sarah, what did you do? I'm not advancing. There we go. Sorry. From the homes and business of the elite class to the fields and the homes of tenant farmers, from the bateau to the schooners, those river and ocean-going vessels we see so often in paintings. That they were in the mills, both the grist and the saw. That they were also in the silversmith shops, the nurseries, the laundry rooms, the kitchens, the marketplaces, and on the teams mending and building roads, houses, barns, and wells, and well, they were everywhere. I understand that perhaps this is not the history you may have learned in school. For many of us, the presence of enslaved Africans in the history of New York either wasn't part of the history we studied in school, or it has been envisioned to be small and slight in number and short in the length of time. The research into the 4 generations of the Phillips family and the discovery of generations of enslaved Africans mirrors that what we find in each of the 17th and 18th century elite families. But we really can't stop there, because when we look at the lives of those within the middling class and the tenant farmer class, we will find the enslaved showing up in multiple generations there also. Many of us have a vision of what a colonial New York or a colonial city, town, farmscape looked like, and more often than not, it does not include the enslaved. In the large scheme of things, when you imagine colonial New York history, it is probably wiser to imagine fewer farmhands and servants of European heritage. Things would be more accurate if you place a lot of those images of people of the labor class with more enslaved Africans and people of African descent. I invite you to begin shifting that mental picture, because without them, what you envision of colonial New York is incorrect. 2 years after the founding of the West India Company in 1624, 11 men of African descent were purchased in Fort Orange and enslaved by the company. They were the first, but they were not the last. And a colony that for most of its early history struggled with a low European population, enslaved Africans filled the gap. But they were more than just a labor force. For many, they were also a source of income. They were vital links into a long-lasting relationships between families and folks that spanned the world. The research into the history of slavery in New York really is not that old, especially when we consider how much we know about the East Coast Southern colonies. This, coupled with the prevalence of historic narratives that speak predominantly of white men as if they existed alone, or perhaps with a wife, has cut out not only the middling and tenant European classes, but definitely has failed to properly identify all those servants and farmhands we read about in letters, diaries, legal papers, newspapers, broadsides, and more ephemera created during the period. What is happening in New York around the colonial period history these days actually has been growing in vigor for about the last 40 years. It isn't that people didn't know that slavery existed in New York, but it was a subject that they just didn't really want to deal with. For instance, and a formerly often used resource here at Phillips Manor Hall, a book written by Edward Hageman Hall, published in 1912 for the American Scenic Society on the history of the Phillips family and this estate. He mentions slaves in several places, but it was always done as if it was a joke, or it was coupled with the still undocumented white servants as if the presence of the enslaved were not that big of a deal. To date, however, although Hall mentions white staff along with the enslaved, we have yet to find any documentable evidence of their presence. But the names of the enslaved showed up in ledgers, wills, inventories, account books, census records, state confiscation records, and in other places. New York's enslaved history has also been hidden underneath the history of Southern slavery that has been taught and is still being taught in American schools, including those here in New York. And since it is not a subject that many delve in beyond what we learn in school, the reality has been flying under most people's radar. What has caused what seems like this sudden explosion of the presence of the enslaved in our history here in New York, in many ways, is really the result of a push by world's citizens demanding that the history of the period of exploration and the transatlantic slave trade be told with more truth. The ongoing denial of the impact of this period and its effect on global diversification and the stratification of societies and peoples would not lead us towards healing or reclamation. This reality has sent folks all over the world back into their archives, records, and using them to link and correct information that is shared with the public. And it is definitely happening here in New York. As more countries stepped up in the history version of the Me Too movement, the curiosity of people within numerous fields related to history has exploded. 30 or so years ago, the universe stepped in and provided several significant scholars in New York to advance this work. Two of them are Dr. Charles Gehring at the New York State Archives New Netherland Project and the archaeologist Dr. Paul Huey. Their work and the work of many others has gotten our ball rolling. Along with the work within the academy, the common expansion of society through building and various construction processes has also pushed things along. The finding of the African burial ground in Manhattan when a federal building was being built and the public's outcry not to cover it up made sure that this vital history was not pushed under the building's proverbial rug. All around New York State, other burial grounds which happened with development were not so lucky. Remains from known burial grounds, including one in Inwood near Dyckman Farmhouse, was publicly displayed and the remains destroyed. The long history of our cities and towns, especially those along the Hudson and Mohawk Valley, river valleys, and those out on Long Island, means that it is vitally important that public works departments look not to just mid-20th century maps, but those from the 17th, 18th, and early 19th century. Burial grounds were usually placed on land that was out of the way, land no one wanted to cultivate. But now that land is part of our expanding cities and towns. But we run into this problem repeatedly. The absence of the awareness of New York as a society with slaves means there is no thought of searching older maps and records. People in the middle of working on something find remains, then go looking for maps, bringing them to documents that have lingered in towns, city records, historic societies, libraries, family attics, and other repositories. Bringing the information we are finding into the world of everyday history allows the enslaved Africans and their descendants to move out from the bottom of the ships and off the sail blocks. We move them into a world where they can become fully human, even when they were considered not. We can begin to remove the chains on their bodies and minds and revel in the genius they shared while working long hours and living under the threat of laws and regulations and the town's whipping posts. By putting them back into the story they lived, we create a much more active, vibrant society, one that, although is not equitable, is less shaming and demeaning to us all. So, what are we finding and what are we doing? There are several layers to this work, all happening simultaneously. They all link up, but the approaches in some cases are very different. For instance, archaeology. One phase has people going back into collections across the state and using research coming from the South, the Caribbean, the West Indies, Brazil, Africa, and Europe on Central and West African cultures, material cultures, and religious practices, and seeing if they have some of what is being shared and shown. It is rare that they do not. Many of these collections have lingered for years. Dug 20, 30 years ago, they were conserved and stored, and they still linger, waiting for their time in the display case. There is a misunderstanding about where the enslaved in New York came from. It was, and for many still is, believed that throughout the supposed limited time of New York slavery that those enslaved came from the South. We know, however, that the period of enslaved coming from the South is actually very short. For most of the time, Africans were brought directly here from the continent. They may have been part of a larger parcel sold in the Caribbean and the West Indies, or they were brought directly from the continent into the colony and sold from here down south. Whatever the case, they were more directly connected to Africa, and with that being the case, they left many cultural artifacts that we have dismissed. To be able to correctly interpret and share these findings, the study of Central and West African religious practices is also taking place. The speed of which this work can be shared with the public is based on the time it takes often to delve into information, but also to understand what it means and to be sensitive to the nature of people's religious practices. Many early anthropologists, ethnographers, and museum professionals wrote volumes on this subject, but their biases are glaring, colored amazingly all through much of what we have. We see that more clearly now because African scholars are writing and publishing, and many of the early works written by African scholars are being translated from either French or German into English. Another area of archaeology is active digs. They continue to happen. And although few are happening in the southern parts of the state where the ground has been disturbed quite a lot, on Long Island's southern tip at Sylvester Manor, mid-state in Albany, central and western New York, significant pieces are still being found. We are identifying shells, beads, crystals, worked bone tools, knapped glass tools, and a range of other objects in spaces where the enslaved lived and worked. At a recent New York Archaeological Conference at the State Museum in Albany, archaeologists presented information on their recent works. And even as they spoke, I could hear others in the audience talking about finding similar objects and being totally unaware of what they may have possibly found. So it is not only how we educate or share to the public, it is also about how the information is being shared within various circles of people working in the field of history. The desire to put people, all people, back into the historic narrative has reached into document caches happening from the state archives all the way down to local historic societies. At a recent talk I did in Ravenna, a conversation highlighted the frustration many are experiencing. Although my talk was on colonial foodways, one conversation really stuck out to me. My host had been working on researching a prominent family in the area, but said that he found it odd that he hadn't any references of them owning enslaved. During our chat, we discussed the variety of documents that they needed to research. Several days later, I received an email from him telling me they found a number of people listed on 2 inventories. They had numbers and names, and they showed up on the census with first names and no last names. This speaks to a period of transition from enslaved to free, an area that is greatly under-researched. The research work done on the Phillips family, although extensive, is far from complete. Like many large manor lords, the four generations of tenants on the 50,000 acres of land have only slightly been looked at. Within the last 3 years, research on the founding fathers of Irvington, most of whom were Phillips tenants, revealed the presence of a number of enslaved Africans. Records of the other tenants on the property, which covered most of Lower Westchester, has barely begun. The years of searching through newspapers in the Hudson River Valley area done by Susan Cohen and Ashley Bianchi resulted in a wonderful book. Most of us have become a constant resource. The runaway ads found in Defiance allow us to see the physical descriptions of people down to even the tribal markings on their faces. These runaway ads are separated by villages, towns, and cities, shows an amazing array of the enslaved saying no more to bondage and self-emancipating. We are looking forward to an updated book, which will include perhaps maybe 300 or so more ads coming out sometime later this year. Many of the ads call for the attention of ship owners and captains, speaking directly to the busy harbors that we have in New York. Throughout the state historic site system, research on the enslaved is ongoing as we update exhibits in a number of our sites. Even at a site like Stottsburg, which falls in the Gilded Age, have begun to look at the early years and question if there were any enslaved there and why they are not there in the latter part of the 19th century. This type of research rolls into immediate programming. Currently, several state historic sites, including Claremont, the home of the Livingstons, Washington's headquarters in Newburgh, Senate House in Kingston, and several others, are being updated to not only include information on those enslaved on the properties, but also to speak to the history of Native Americans, women, tenant farmers, and others who have been left out of the story. Because this research is vital and is happening in so many places, the names of enslaved are popping up everywhere. No longer can we deny their presence when we can say and wear their names. This simple transformation are often the results of years of research. Research on some of the largest farms and manors like Rensselaerwick has not even really started. Yet, we know that although the relation in general populace of the percentage of Albany is smaller than it was in Brooklyn, in relationship to just straight numbers, Albany at one point holds the largest population of enslaved in the colony. After all of these years, it is hard to imagine, but truthfully, we are not even halfway through the work that needs to be done to restore the balance, to return the enslaved and the free Africans to their rightful place in New York colonial history. When the English took possession of New Amsterdam in 1664, about 1,500 people lived there, roughly 10% of whom were of African origin. In 1737, a door-by-door census counted 8,666 New Yorkers, 6,947 white, and 1,719 Blacks. That means in New York City alone, 1 out of every 5 people was Black, and nearly all of them were enslaved. And that was just one location. We still need to fully restore the links to the historic global economy that New York helped to create. From the Caribbean to the West Indies or Brazil, the enslaved of people here, or the growing of wheat to feed the enslaved there, needs further research. The connection to people, families, industries, towns, and cities go from the Dutch New Netherland period until the ending of US slavery. The success of the 30 or so years often considered the Underground Railroad period during the antebellum years is because of the thousands of people of African descent that were already here in New York and had been here for generations. Many of those freedom seekers could not hide in plain sight if the enslaved and newly free population had not existed. Their presence is why people like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman chose to move here. As we approach the commemoration of the 400th anniversary of the first men purchased and enslaved in 2026, and the 200th anniversary of the emancipation in New York in 2027, it is vital that we continue to research and restore the enslaved in New York's colonial history. No one person, group, or entity can do this work alone. Even as people cry out for presence, many are unaware that there are many, many people working every day, and they have been for years, and that there are new people joining this work every day. It is vital that the history of colonial New York be restored to the international, multilingual environment that it was. To do that, we must put the Africans and their descendants back into the narratives. They did not live for 400 years in the bottoms of ships. They came on land, and in horrific conditions, they survived and they thrived. It is our responsibility to honor their legacies. It is our duty to clean up American history by putting back all of those who have been erased, be they Black, Native, women, poor, or whatever. We can no longer just look to the few names of men or women, white or Black, whose names we say so often, who have so many streets and schools named after them, those with 2, 3, 4 statues already, and continue to ignore the thousands that made their lives and their work possible. They did not live alone. They did not work alone. They had help, and the help needs help. And we all can be more supportive of them by looking for them and putting them back into their rightful places. Thank you. I think we'll leave that last one up for our Q&A.
Okay, so I hope folks online can hear me. We have a couple of questions online that I thought I'd read. So Jared is asking, what was the term or terms used to describe the Africans who were enslaved in the Dutch and British eras, please? Was it Africans? And then he says Negroes was in the map that was shown.
They were Negroes, they were wenches, they were servants. They were often called by the job title they did. So just as because they were the servant class, they were called the cook, they were called the lady's maid, or they were called by their first names. Legally, they could not have last names. So you either called them by their name or you called them by their position. But I must say, there is no such thing as an enslaved African American. And that is a term that keeps showing up. And I'm sorry, I know a lot of my scholarly friends are balking, but for me, it's just wrong. We're not Americans. Nobody is an American in the colonial period, right? You're a British citizen or you're a Dutch citizen, but you're not an American. And it will take a few rounds of amendments when Blacks can stop being 3/5 of a person or 3/4 of a person and become a whole person, and then a couple more before we actually become Americans. So you will see Negro a lot. You will see the term nigger a lot. In terms of women, they're often called wenches. Negro wench is a common term, particularly in the runaway ads. You'll see that, or in any of the sales ads, you'll see that. They're rarely referred, or they're called girls, but they're rarely called a woman. So those are some of the common terms.
Thank you. We have another question from Shar. Can you comment a bit on what we are learning about enslavement of Native Americans and if there were any differences in practice of enslaving Africans? For example, Catherine Phillips's will referred to her, quote, Indian slaves.
There was a period of enslavement of natives, and there also, it was stopped by law. And I'm sorry, I can't recall the year that happened. But we, even here in the exhibit, we have a photograph of a carved image of a ship from Sylvester Manor that was done by enslaved Indian boys. But there is a period where the natives are enslaved, but it's very short. And also there is that question of when they're referred to as Indian, are they native or are they Indian from the West Indies? So that is still a lingering question there, but there is that record. But I have to be honest, I have so much African history to learn. The state's Parks Department actually now, thankfully, has an interpreter of Native American history. So I defer all of that history to my colleague.
And then one more question online so far. Latifa asks, what are some clarifications? She says, did you state at one point during the enslavement that Albany had the largest number of enslaved people?
Yes. Now, what throws that off, most of the time when we're talking about the numbers of enslaved, we do it by percentages. And that percentage is based on the general population. So there is a higher percentage of enslaved in Brooklyn, but the population of people in Brooklyn is smaller, so that percentage number is higher. But if we're gonna just do straight number counts, there are more enslaved at one point, and I'm sorry, I don't remember the year ranges in Albany, but the population of Albany is larger, so that makes the percentage of enslaved smaller. So people look at those percentages, but that's not body count. And I had to read that in several places, several times to make sure I got that right.
Yeah. So wait, before you talk, Lavada, if you can just repeat any questions from the in-person crowd so that the folks online can hear us, I would appreciate it. Thank you.
Oh, sure.
So, I've read that Adolphus Phillips was the first slaves here in by New York. There was always talk about the slave market down in New York City, and when you were Adolphus was.
It was closer where he needed them to be. I would think that that is, we have no explanation why Adolf chose to do that, but, oh, I'm sorry. Adolf, the first enslaved at Phillips Manor, there were 9. There were 8 men and a boy. The 8 men went to the upper mills. The boy was sent with a bag of pepper into New York City. And the question was, why would Adolphus Phillips choose to dock in Rye and not dock in Manhattan? I could only assume because it was a shorter walk or shorter transportation, but we have no records to indicate at all why he made that choice.
I had read that maybe there was a tax on slaves when they arrived in what was that?
Yes, there was, and the Phillips family were notorious for skirting the laws. That's one of the reasons why here in New York, we actually are one of the few places that have enslaved from Madagascar. They directly imported from Madagascar. You know, in our history, we can legitimately talk about pirates. They had a long-standing relationships with pirates there, and they avoid paying taxes that way. But throughout the Phillips family, particularly the first 2 generations, that would be Frederick Phillips I, Philip Phillips, and Adolphus Phillips, his brother, or Adolf. There are many instances where they are known for skirting the laws. You're welcome.
So
Yes.
I have a, related question online from Catherine, who says, can you talk more about where the enslaved in New York City generally came from? Barbados, countries in Africa, West Indies, etc.
Well, it depends on who's importing them. Let's see if I can go back. The one map I showed were actually the slave voyages of Frederick Phillips' first couple of generations. So this is the Phillips families trading. So we can see they're coming from Madagascar, they're coming from the East Coast, but they're also coming from the West Coast, around Congo and all up. So it depends on the time period. We know we have people coming from the western part, but we also, most of the initial enslaved are coming out of Angola. We're trading with the Kingdom of Congo. Congo is actually, the Kingdom of Congo is expanding. So it's expansion into Angola. So those initial enslaved are victims of war. Then they're also trading directly out of Congo, but we also have a lot of coming out of what is now Nigeria, up in that area. And a lot of the later, particularly a couple of the finds that are happening upstate, we are finding more Yoruba related religious practices. So they're coming off the upper part. One of the things that is really wonderful now with a lot of the new databases tracking all of the ships, we can find exactly where the ships are coming from, where they stopped, who the owners of the ships were, who the investors were. There are several databases. The Transatlantic Slave Trade database is one of them. But there are several databases that now are giving us a lot of information. And as more countries, particularly even in the Netherlands, as they're going back and translating a lot of the documents, these internationally accessible resources are growing. So we're learning a lot every day. Barbados, we know that the Phillips family had a plantation in Barbados. The question has come up as to whether that was a sugar plantation or if that was a selling plantation. So it may be a mixture of both. And that would have been run by Philip Phillips. Frederick II's father. He dies very early, so his name is not really mentioned as much, but he and his brother worked heavily with their father. So we're learning more every day, and we can get more information on the ships because of that. I'm sorry. Yes, sir.
Yes. Voyages, how many voyages?
We do know, and I don't remember off the top of my head. Michael, do you know how many voyages Frederick and Phillips made?
Yeah, Phillips sort of made voyages in different phases, different members of the Phillips family, but Frederick and his son Adolf made at least 10 voyages to Madagascar in the 1690s. They made several voyages earlier to that, to the Congo Kingdom. And then they were also making a number of voyages mostly to the Caribbean in the 17 teens or so. And from Barbados specifically, they were bringing up what they were called seasoned slaves coming up from the Caribbean who had already perhaps been African born, but had already worked on the sugar plantations. And then they were being brought up here to respond. Just a follow-up. See a number of stops with these.
Yes.
Very rarely do we associate the
Correct.
so
And there are descendants here in Westchester. There's one woman in particular who has traced her lineage back to one of the Madagascar slaves. I don't.
they're not available.
So the question was, how many voyages did the Phillips make? Beginning in the 17th century, going into the 18th century, probably 15 to 17.
All right, so we have more questions online. Meg says, can you talk a little bit about the challenge of trying to represent enslaved people at historic sites without physical images and/or attempting to create interactive spaces via audio or imagery without disrespectful conjecture? How can we continue the process of humanizing persons enslaved at our sites in a respectful and appropriate manner?
The images are a real problem. We are a society now that everybody's got a camera. So everyone comes in saying, why are you using the same images? Or why is this cartoon image there? There's one of a guy in a Revolutionary War suit. It's not a cartoon image. It was just a bad artist. What we are doing, and this came up on Monday, we had the pleasure of having the first conference for the the Northern Slavery Collective. Ooh, brain just froze there. And this came up. So a lot of people were doing different things. We're doing silhouettes, but more and more, we're looking at hiring artists to create images. The awareness of where the enslaved came from, the descriptions, the physical descriptions that we are getting from the runaway ads give us a real indication of just what they look like. Also, one of the things that you see here in the exhibit are facial reconstructions based on the remains of enslaved from Schuyler Flats, which is up above Albany. Because of construction, their burial ground was found. While they were out, their remains were studied, and a forensic anthropologist at New York State Museum recreated their faces. So we have a lot of ways of doing that. And personally, I think that that's important. As long as, we're trying to be as respectful as we can. And with all of the information and that we have about where they were from, we know what the people from those areas look like now. With all of the verbal descriptions we have in the runaway ads, I would rather have an artist use that information and construct an image as opposed to using a silhouette. Some people, some sites are doing, we've seen in many stores, mannequins that are faceless. So they will be white bodies and black bodies and costumes, but they will have no face. So we're trying to do this in a number of different ways. Every historic site that I have spoken to about how they are doing it or how we are doing it, everyone is cautiously moving forward because the absence of imagery is causing more problems than us trying to create a positive replacement, no matter what we do. So we're all just trying to do the best we can with it. But the active conversation at the interpretive unit for the Bureau of Historic Sites is we are more and more looking at hiring artists to start creating these images because it is bothering us that we have so few and we keep using the same ones over and over again. Like there's one beautiful portrait of an enslaved woman on Long Island, but it's in a private collection. And although we have asked several times, they have declined to allow that to go to public. They just don't want people to bother them about it. So we're stuck. So this is what we're choosing to do. We do the best we can, but more and more we're leaning towards hiring artists to create images for us. Yes, you often see them lurking in the back. In fact, we're gonna, in family portraits, do we see images of enslaved? And yes, you often see them lurking in the back, like on this slide, right? So you see them here, you'll see them, there's a very famous picture you see of a Rensselaer boy. Many people think it's a girl. And there's an enslaved person behind them. If you see many of the portraits of George Washington, you will see an enslaved person in the back. If you look at a lot of 18th century family portraiture, you also see enslaved in the back, or they're kneeling at someone's feet. This came to mind there's a movie called Belle about a woman who was born into an English family. And in the beginning, she's looking at all these portraits at the family's estate, and there's an enslaved person in the background of several of them. So that's what we see. Yes.
One of my favorite pictures of an enslaved African in the Revolutionary War was a person that worked with General Lafayette. The famous portraiture. Armstrong was a slave who was freed by his owner to fight in the Revolutionary War. Worked with George Washington and Lafayette. And interestingly enough, he went back to slavery. It was Lafayette's intervention. It's a very proud, striking.
Yeah, there's, and I think it's the one maybe in this collection, he's in this wonderful red turban. But there are a number of images from the Rev War period with enslaved men holding horses, or you see them in the background. Lafayette intervened for a number of people. He actually also intervened with Hannah Till, the woman who was Washington's cook. On his return visit, he went to see her and she was destitute. She was elderly and destitute. And he actually paid off her mortgage and provided her enough funds to live out the rest of her life. So he was very sensitive to enslavement here.
Sorry, I have a related question from online from Ashley, who says, on Monday you spoke about artwork in Black burial grounds. I wondered if you can explain your opinion a little more on this.
Can you go back to that question? I didn't quite hear you.
On Monday, you spoke about artwork in Black burial grounds. I wondered if you can explain your opinion on this a little more.
I am challenged around some of the choices that are being made when we look at artifact Black burial grounds. And I know this is probably not PC. And I know I'm probably putting myself out on a limb here. But we need the artifacts left intact. We need the presence of the enslaved to be seen as they chose to bury themselves. When we choose, the moment we put a modern piece of art within a period setting, it has stopped being artifact. And there's just nothing we can do about that. One of our challenges is to honor our ancestors. And many feel that to do that, we must have their graves or their grave places, their burial places, match that of Europeans. But when we do that, we take away the period artifact. When so many burial grounds have been lost, when so many burial grounds have had the field stones removed, even if the land has not been developed, we lose their work. We lose their traditions. We have found field stones with Dakinga marked on them. That is the Bakongo religious cosmogram. We have found field stones marked with initials on them. People have chose to honor their loved ones and families the best way they could. We need that presence. We need that presence intact. So when we put art within that burial space, we ruin that. We ruin that. So it is a dance. It is a real dance. Now we can put a barrier up and have all that modern art in front of the graveyard and the graveyard on the other side. I am totally fine with that. I just ask, as a historian, looking for that presence and trying to help people understand that they were here, that the few known burial grounds with the field stones still in place, that we honor that and we leave them as they are. My soapbox. I'm sorry about this a moment, sir.
On that final note, I agree with you. Bring them to a place, put burial, show them these are where the slaves were buried. And in this country, they tear everything down. So you have to protect that, show people, especially young people, feel it's too, everything's visual. They don't get the feeling of seeing somebody, see the ground.
Right.
Rather go to YouTube or, use their phone.
And then how do we connect back to Africa? How do we connect our traditions that are happening here to the traditions that are also happening in the South or happening in the West Indies or throughout the diaspora? We need those links, and particularly if they're outside of urban environments.
Vinnie Bagwell did work
Okay.
Our apologies for the technical difficulties. I was fully charged but didn't plug in, and then I went dead. And anyway, I really love her work, but I also have to say her work is not appropriate for every place, and any artwork is not appropriate for every place. So we have to decide where is that art appropriate and where it is not. I love what she did down there, and it's really cool.
Can you just people asking who you're talking about because you said it.
Oh, sorry. Here in Yonkers, the artist Vinnie Bagwell has done the enslaved rain garden down on the waterfront. And if you have not seen it, I do invite you to go see it. It is beautiful work. And that imagery is really important. And I love the fact that she selected names for those images for her creations that link to other areas or link to the African cultures of people that were part of the slave trade. The names that she has given them, however, are not names of people that were actually enslaved here. They are names that she chose for her work. And I appreciate the work that she is doing. Overall, though, personally, and this is my personal opinion, we need less individual figures and more figures supporting the groups. Or we really just need to rethink statuary overall. But that's just about my love of art. I would like to see, I love bronze statues, but I want to see some wooden ones. I want to see some marble ones. I want to see some other avenues of art. But I think that they're great.
We have another question online. Sorry, we're sharing a screen now.
That's okay.
Okay, I'm gonna go back because I've been kind of jumping around. So, yeah, here it is. No, it's okay. We don't have to pay.
You can like read the questions and I'll stand here.
Okay, there we go. No. All right, so Meg said, can you talk a little bit about the challenge of trying to represent, no, we already did that one, sorry. Where is it? It's Chloe. Yeah, Chloe. Wondering if you can share any more details about enslaved and free people working on the river or on the waterfront. I'm doing some research for work about Black workers in the maritime trades, and I'm really curious about how to dig deeper, especially in the early era. You want me to?
Yes.
Don't know, I spent 10 years at the Hudson River Maritime Museum in Kingston. It's a great museum. You guys should go visit. But definitely there were lots of Black workers, both in the sloop and schooner era and in the steamboat era. We have evidence here at Phillips Benner Hall that the Phillipses had enslaved boatmen. Mm-hmm. There are lots of references, as Lovato said earlier, to the runaway slave ads of people saying, you know, like masters of ships, because that's what non-naval captains were called in the period, masters. Ship masters, don't let these people on your boats, which means they probably are going on the boats, right? We have other evidence of people working on ships. And for sure, great resources for the 19th century are newspapers and some corporate records. The Maritime Museum has done some research on that topic, so I recommend reaching out to them. That's of course 19th century, so that's post-slavery.
But even in the runaway ads, you have references of enslaved men. Even though the ad is for the captain, it's because in the ad they say was a former sailor or had worked on a ship. So there, those references for their going back to that type of work do exist. So yeah, and I keep seeing there's a picture of a woman on a cover. She's on a boat on the river, and I can't think of the name of the book.
I had one more question. Where is it? Yes. Okay. Question about the tenant farmers, which you already spoke to a little bit about. Did the tenant farmers own slaves or rent them from the Phillipses?
Both. And that's one of the challenges we have around seeing the enslaved. In the American education system, when we went to school, slavery was connected to the South and the plantations. A plantation is a large farm worked as one unit with a resident labor force. So for instance, Mount Vernon, George Washington's estate, 50,000 acres, 317 slaves, both domestic and agricultural. Here at Phillips Manor, you have a 52,000 acre estate, but the family is not working that as a single farm. Around the house here in Yonkers, they're controlling 300 acres. Around the Upper Mill property, they're controlling 500 acres. The rest of the property is broken into smaller farms and leased to Northern European tenants. Averages of 150 to 200 acres in size. The farms actually go from 100 to 600 acres in size. And we know that many of those tenants were enslavers. So when we talk about the numbers here, most people want to look at just the houses of the elite, but because they literally were the labor force throughout the whole social strata, you have to go to the tenant records. You have to look at the census, but you can also, before the census, you can look at tenant wills, inventories, and the enslaved will show up there. So in a middling class family, you have to go to the will or you have to go to their inventory. And for those who are not familiar, if you die without a will, an inventory of all of your possessions is taken. And the inventories often are a lot more detailed than a will would be, because it is, you're gonna have, your family's gonna have to pay taxes, right? So they literally go through every room and they list everything, from the bed curtains to the shirts, to the number of buttons and shoes, to the number of enslaved, the cows, the chickens, everything. They count them all. So we often see them there. And following those inventories being taken, there often are estate sales. And then you can follow through if those records exist for a particular family, you can find them in the estate sales. So for instance, for those, when Adolf died without a will, his inventory is taken. We have all of those details, and it is one of the only references we have for the Negro house that was on that property. A foundation for that has never been found, but it shows up in documents. And then we have the sale records. So we know who bought the enslaved, we know what they paid for them. Some of them, you know, left a down payment and then were paid off in time. So we even know how that process happened because of all of those legal records.
Just to clarify, Adolf Phillips was at the Upper Mills.
Yes, when Frederick Phillips I died, the 52,000 acres was broken in half. Adolf inherited the Upper Mill. Frederick II, his grandson, got the lower property. So Frederick got this house and Adolf got the upper house. Then when Adolf dies, and during that period, the title Lord of the Manor cannot be used because not a single person owned the entire manor. But once Adolf died and Frederick II inherited his property, he could then go back to legally using the term Lord of the Manor. Any other questions, anyone? Yes, ma'am.
How would you describe selling plant? What's the difference between selling plantation versus?
Oh, a sugar plantation.
A sugar plantation.
Yeah.
It was more for housing enslaved. Like they may have been working there, but the purpose was a place to offload enslaved, give them an opportunity to recover, and then put them out for sale. So yes, they may have been growing sugar there, but that was not their primary purpose. That it was a place for them to use as a stopping point for all their ships. Barbados was very busy. And there's actually a lot of research starting in Barbados going through the archive to relink New York with that. And I know my colleague, Donna Marie Barnes out at Sylvester Manor, their family also have a plantation in Barbados, and she's working with the archive to try to find some of that information.
We have two more questions from online.
Okay.
So Dean says, I was wondering if you could explain more about the presence of enslaved people working in craftsman roles, such as smiths, carpenters, tailors, and if there is any evidence of generational passing down of these professions in enslaved families and communities.
We know they're there because they show up in the records, they show up in the letters. I don't know about generational. For me, I look at the bigger pictures. I deep dive into the cooks because that's my area, my specialty area. Otherwise, it's overall. So we have evidence of them being in the craft shops. We have evidence, but I have not done any follow-up as to whether or not they generationally will then do that once they are freed.
I had the impression that so often families are
We don't have a lot of families to start with.
the generational would not even be.
No, but if like,
Yeah, so
So-
the question is about, would there be generational transference because families were often broken up?
so if you did happen to have someone that you live with, would you be passing that skill? Or once you were freed, would you pass on that skill? That's the question. But we actually don't have a lot of intact families. New York purposefully did not want intact families. They often gave away children very early. They kept couples separated. And we have more men than women. Yeah, we are not a breeding society. We are a working society.
Okay, another question from Pam. Are there many surviving examples of documents recording the renting of an enslaved person from one enslaver to someone else? What are such documents called?
Yes, there are records, and usually they're letters. They're just letters. I'm thinking of like the letters that are in John Jay's collection, the letters that we have in Claremont's collection. Generally, they're just letters. And you just write out a letter saying I want to rent somebody or I'll loan you somebody. A lot of you can look at the account books. You also may find them there. But we're finding these kinds of things in generally letters and account books. That's where pretty much they're showing up, in letters and account books. And are they around? Yes. We have so many documents that haven't been read. And that is one of the struggles that many historic societies, local caches, smaller historic societies particularly have, is they have a lot more documents that haven't been read, haven't been transcribed. And we're also running into the fact that a lot of people can't read cursive. That's killing us. So if you can read cursive and you've got time, go volunteer at a historic site, particularly to transcribe. If you have that skill set, particularly if you're retired, you need to do something for a couple hours a week, go volunteer at a historic site. That is a real problem because the documents are aging. Iron gall ink is eating the paper. Mice are eating the paper. Humidity is harming the paper. And we don't have enough qualified archival storage for this paper. So we need to get these things scanned. We need to get them transcribed as fast as we can. We're losing the documents and we need to catch up. So, and because so many other subjects became important, about 12, 15 years ago, New York stopped teaching cursive. So we actually have young people entering the world of history who cannot read cursive. And that's not just affecting colonial period history. That's all the way up to World War II. That's all the way up to the 60s and the 70s. Before everybody had, texting, we were doing cursive. So this is a challenge within the industry. So if you have time to volunteer, your help is greatly needed.
Oh gosh, we just got a whole bunch more questions.
Because I said something wrong.
I don't think so. I think people are just thinking of more stuff.
Mm.
All right, Susan Stessen-Cohen is actually on this call. She's one of the authors of In Defiance, and she noted that runaway slave notices also have information about renting people. Oh, Vera wants to know what happened to the slaves in New York when they became free. I'm just having a conversation.
Oh, wow. Were they free?
Oh, were they?
How do you free an enslaved person in New York? Does anybody know? We're trying to figure that out too. 2027 is not the ending of slavery in let me get this straight.
1827.
1827 does not free everyone. It is the legal ending of the practice of slavery. Some people were freed. Some people fell through the cracks because of the age requirement. So one day they're a slave, the next day they're an indentured servant. But they're still bound to the same house, same family, and will be. The last person is not freed until the 1840s. Current research shows that there may be 2 people who were never freed. That's one of the complicated things about the whole gradual manumission thing. So to manumit someone means that you are freeing them when slavery is still the law of the land. Emancipation means you are freeing them or you're ending legal enslavement. So we grew up with the Emancipation Proclamation, which one day you're enslaved, next day you're free, except for Texas. But that is not how it works here in New York. Some people, there's a whole age requirement. For a while, there was a skill requirement. If you are deemed unfit, like if you're elder and you can't take care of yourself, you cannot be manumitted and you cannot also be emancipated. So you remain. So it's convoluted. It's really convoluted. So in 2027, what we are commemorating is the ending of legal enslavement, the ending of the institution of slavery, but not the freeing of all the folks. I'm getting better at it.
Yes. Right. Vera, no, I just did hers. Linda says, why do enslavers in New York want intact enslaved families? Was that to try to prevent entire families from seeking their freedom together?
There are some letters left that say that the mother would be too much influence on the child. But it also, when you have to raise your own child, you don't have time to raise somebody else's child. And it gets in the way of profit. It interrupts your lifestyle. It just, they can't do their work. They got to take care of their kids. I am more important. They need to take care of me and my kids. So it's about their job. It's about them being able to do their job. And it's just easier to bring people in and buy more people than it is to breed them, because then you take somebody out of service. So that is my take on it. But it's common. It's common across the board.
Irony is that that's a lot of runaway notices, is people going to see their families.
And that's what comes up at the runaway notices. They're probably going to where they were because that's where their mother is, or that's where their wife is, or that's where their child is.
Okay. The rest of the comments are all about the Hear Me Now, the Black Potters of Old Edgefield, South Carolina exhibit currently on at the Met.
Yes.
Okay. Any last questions?
But I will also do a shout out for another exhibit at the Met. it's on African civilizations. The Met is redesigning the African galleries, and they are basing that on the work of Sheikh Anta Diop. And it is putting Egypt back in Africa. There's a small display while the larger galleries are being redone. It is amazing, and I encourage everyone to go see it. Thank you all for coming. And I will let Sarah handle the sign-off.
All right. Yes. Thank you, everyone who joined us in person and online. Our next talk is in March, on March 8th. It's called She Merchants, Sachems, and Slaves, Women of Colonial New York. I will be giving that talk with one of our museum interpreters, Donna Cruz. So I hope we'll see you back here in a month. Thank you also to our Friends group for helping to support our lecture series. We do them every month, usually on the second Wednesday of the month. And we've got, I think, through June is up online if you want to check out our other offerings. So I'm going to end the meeting for those folks online. Folks in person, if you want to stay and chat, you can. Otherwise, we'll see you next time.
Good.